So here is part 2 of the section 1 day 1 notes. We are still talking about graphing piecewise functions. For this part, we are going to be talking specifically about step functions, which is a special type of piecewise function, and then do basically a word problem. So as I said, step function is a special type of piecewise function to graph results in steps, meaning that we are going to have horizontal lines or segments or rays, just depending on what we have. Okay, looking at example 3, we have our piecewise function. Now you can kind of see that we have now 3 equations instead of 2. Now, no matter what, the number of equations tell you how many XY tables you should create. Now, if you kind of get a hang for these step functions, you might not have to create a table, but I would advise create your table. It makes it easier to know what is the open or closed circles and what points you need to graph and which way the graphs go. Okay, so I have it for -4. I have an XY table for that. I have it for 1. And I have it for 7. Okay. Now, just like we did before, we always start at the restriction when we are filling in our XY table. So our restriction for the -4 is x is less than -5. We need to start at -5. Now, because x is less than, correct, that means we want numbers smaller. So kind of fill that in. What numbers would we have smaller? Okay, I would choose like -6, -7. If you want to do like -8, you can. Now, go ahead and put down, what do you think the y values for each of these x values are going to be? Go ahead and pause the video and fill that out for me. Okay, let's see what you got. Well, hopefully if you remember from example 2, when we had 15 as our equation, whenever it's a number, that means it is a constant, okay? Which represents that this is going to be the y value for all of these x values. So I have -4, -4, -4, -4. Now, what type of line is this going to make? Hopefully, you either said it out loud, or you could be thinking in your head, you said horizontal, okay? Okay, now let's get to the next one. So for the 1, oh, do you see something a little bit different here? If you look, we not only have 1, but now we have 2 restrictions. So how do we do our XY table when we have 2 restrictions? Well, this is how you do it. You now need to include both restrictions if you do have 2. I would say start from the smallest and then go to the largest, but it is up to you how you would like to fill this out. I'm going to do that because I like doing it that way. It kind of helps me. Now, what you need to do is pick a couple of numbers in between the 2 restrictions. So we could pick like -4 and -3. Okay, if you wanted to put -2, you can if you want to. It's up to you. Now we do the same thing here, okay? Let's look at our equation. It is 1. What do you think is going to be the y value for each of those x values? Hopefully you recognize it's going to be 1 as well, because that is a constant. Anytime you have just a constant, meaning no variables, that is going to be the y value for every single x. Okay, I would like you guys to go ahead and do the next XY table. So pause the video and fill out this XY table for 7. Okay, let's go over this one. So notice, once again, we have 2 restrictions. We need to include both of them. We have -1 and we have a +4. Pick a couple of numbers in between. I like 0, and I'm going to do 1. Okay. You can also do 2 or 3. Now your y values, because once again, this is a constant, should be 7 for all of them here, okay? So now our next step is to do, is it an open or closed circle for first point? Okay, -5, -4, because that was part of the restriction. We need to talk about, is this going to be an open or closed circle? Hopefully you thought of open circle, because if we look at the restriction, there's no equal bar. I'm going to go ahead and plot this. So we have -5, and then down -4. 1, 2, 3, 4, down 4. And remember, this should be a horizontal, in this case, ray, because we have a starting point, and then it goes on forever in one direction. So all of these, and then you got a little arrow there. Okay, now for our next one, because were two restrictions, we need to talk about for both of them if they're going to be open or closed. So let's talk about the first one, -5, 1. If we look at the inequality right next to -5, notice there is an equal bar, meaning that this point is going to be closed. However, for the other restriction or other part of the restriction, -1, that inequality right next to it, it does not have an equal bar. So at -1, 1, that is going to be open, okay? So let's go to -5. We are up 1, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up 1. That's going to be open. We go to -1, 1. -5, 1, that's going to be closed. We go to -1, 1, that's going to be open. And then we have a line there. Now notice, what does this make? Think about geometry. It makes a segment, right? So when we are doing these, you either can have a ray, and usually you're going to have a ray when it's only one or only one part to the restriction, or a segment when you have two parts to the restriction. Okay, let's go ahead and do the last one. Once again, there are two parts to the restriction, so we need to ask this twice. So for -1, 7, when we plot that point, is that going to be open or closed? Well, hopefully you said closed, because at -1, that has the equal bar, right? Then at 4, 7, will this have an open or closed circle? Hopefully you said open, because there is no equal bar there. Okay. So I go -1 up 7, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that is closed. And then I go to 4, 7, that's open, and I made a segment. Okay. Now, when we have multiple parts to our restriction, it is possible that both points are closed, or both points could be open. Or you could have one closed, one open, or one open, one closed. It just depends on what inequality they give to you there. Okay, so that's how, and this is called a step function. Notice, right, that we have these steps that we can go up or it could go down, okay? Okay, now let's apply all of this information to a word problem, our favorite. Okay, so it says Center High School held a 4-hour fundraising pledge drive. The students organizing the drive counted the total money raised at the end of each hour. The results are shown in the graph below. So let's talk about the graph so we understand it. So it's going to be very important. Okay, so notice hours passed. This is horizontally. So that represents, and they kind of already have it, our x. Okay, so I'm just going to rewrite it to make it bigger. So this is our x-axis. Okay, or the x values, whatever. And then on the vertical axis, this is the total raise, so the amount of money. This is our f of x. Or another way of thinking of it's our y-axis. So these are our end values. Okay? So now that we kind of have that understanding of what's x, what's y, or our f of x, that's how we use it. Now let's answer these questions. Okay, part A says, how much money had the students raised after 2 hours? Now, we look at the 2 hours, we need to figure out, is that our x or the f of x? Well, if it's 2 hours and we look at our graph here, ours represents x values. So that is our x values. Meaning, what are we trying to find? We're trying to find our f of x values, or the y value. So, let's go to 2 hours. Boop. Okay. Now notice there are 2 points. You got an open circle at 400 and a closed at 1,000. Now, remember, an open really doesn't mean it's part of the domain, okay? Everything in between, so from 1 and everything up to 2, is part of the domain. However, this point is not because it's open. It's not included. Anything that is closed, that means it is included, or it's part of the domain, or part of the graph, okay? So if we look here, if that 400 is open, that's not what we really want, because it's not included. But if we go up to 1,000, that is a closed circle that is included. So after 2 hours, the students actually raised $1,000. Okay. So that is going to be an important part to understand. Open means that it is not included, meaning it's not included in the graph, or an idea like it's not included in the domain and range, okay? And closed means that it is included, so it is part of the domain and range, okay? So be careful that you understand open and closed circles. Now, it says, how much did they raise in all, okay? So now we once again have to ask ourselves, what are we trying to find? It should be the money, right? So it's going to be our f of x, or the vertical axis, okay? Go ahead and pause the video and figure out how much did they raise in all. Okay, so let's maybe talk about this, and this might be a little bit difficult. So after 4 hours, because that's the max they went and fundraise, okay, if we look at the max amount of hours and go all the way to the amount of money they made, we can see there's a solid point, right? Solid circle. So that means this 1,800 is included. That represents that at the end of the 4 hours they fundraised, that's the max amount that they made. So it is $1,800. Okay? So I know it's like, oh, that seemed very simple. But you just have to kind of realize and understand the graph, and then it'll become a little bit better. Okay, so this one shouldn't be too bad. It says, what is f of 3.5? This should be very straightforward. Now remember, this 3.5, that represents the x values, okay? X values are the hours. So what we're trying to find when it says f of 3.5, we're trying to figure out, well, what is the y value that corresponds to it? What is the f of x value, okay? So if we look, that has to represent the total amount raised. So find the total amount raised that corresponds with 3.5. Go ahead and pause the video and do that for me right now. Okay, so let's go ahead. So 3.5, we're going to go along the x-axis because these are x values. I go to 3, and it is going to be this point, or this spot right here where I have my mouse, okay? So now I need to figure out where is my point, right? I want a solid point. So I go up, oh, here it is. Now, though we don't see like a solid point, this is still close, just like when we did some of those step functions. It is still part of it because it's horizontal, it's a constant. So we kind of read this function. It looks like this line segment is in between 1,400, 1,600. So I would say halfway in between is about 15. So our final answer for this one would be $1,500. Now make sure when you're doing this, and I'm going to be very picky on this, make sure you are using your units. We are in dollars when we're talking about total raised, okay? So notice that I did put dollars for like A, B, and C, so make sure you have your units. Okay, now D. This one we're going to talk and do actually together. It says, on what interval does f of x equal 400? Now we need to make sure we understand what does that 400 represent. If we look, right, it's not in this x spot, it's on the other side of the equal symbol. That means this is the total raised. That is our f of x value, okay? Or if you want to go back to the idea of x and y, it's our y value, okay? So you got your x and you got your y value. Total raised is your y value. Meaning we need to figure out the x values for which 400 is the answer, okay? So let's go to our y values of 400. Oh, there we go. This is actually where we're going to write like a restriction if we were writing a piecewise function. So looks like the x value we start on is 1, and we go all the way to 2. Okay, so I'm going to put those numbers, leave some room, okay? Let me make sure you guys can see this. There you go, 1, 2, okay. Now, basically, the hours passed is being used as x, so that's our variable that we're going to have in between, okay, so we're looking for x values. Now, notice that at 1, it's a closed circle, meaning, are we going to have an equal symbol? Yes. Now, we want x values that are in between 1 and 2, meaning that 1 has to be less than, in this case, equal to x. Now, what about 2? Do we have an equal bar there? No. So x is going to be less than 2. Basically, this interval represents that x is in between 1 and 2 hours, okay? Okay, so now we are talking about domain, and then we'll do range, and then basically we're done with this. So yay! Okay, so domain. Remember, domain, what does that deal with? X or Y? That should deal with our x values, or the horizontal axis, okay? So meaning, what are all the values we use on this horizontal? Go and pause the video and answer this for me. And you don't have to write it in a certain way, just kind of put down, what do you think it is, the domain? Okay, so let's think about this. Notice we have a closed circle at 0. So we do start at 0. And remember, they fundraised all the way up to 4 hours. So our domain basically goes from 0 to 4. Okay, so we're going to write it in a similar fashion as we did on D, as this here, using inequalities. So as an interval. Okay, so we start at 0, right? And then the largest number is 4. X is the variable we are using and should be in between. Now, at 0, do we have an open or closed circle? It's closed, meaning we are going to have an equal bar. As well for 4, is there an open or closed circle for that one? There is a closed, so that also has an equal bar. Okay, now our last one is going to be the range. This is going to look a little bit different, because let's ask this. Remember, range is our vertical. Do we hit every single Y value? Like, do we hit 600, 800, 1200, 1400? No. So we can't really write our range in this sense here, okay? What we have to do is we're going to list the numbers that are included. So anytime there is a closed circle, we're going to list that Y value, okay? So we have Y, or you can also say f of x, because that's really our Y values, right? So our f of x, you're going to see this little symbol. We're not really going to talk a lot about that, but this is just something you can see maybe later down the road, like in pre-calculus. This is just saying includes. So f of x includes, because that's our Y values. And then we're going to do a little curly bracket, meaning we're going to list some of the values. Okay, so for the Y, I see 0, 400 has a closed circle, and 1,000 has a closed circle. So let me go ahead and write those numbers down. So we'll have to scroll back up for this. Okay, what else? I see 1,500. Remember, we kind of talked about that. And then I see 1,800 as well. So those are the other two values. Okay. And now I'm going to close my list with a curly bracket. Okay. So this is just saying that f of x, which we also represent as y, it's the y values, but they do show f of x up here, so that's why we're using that instead of y. So our range includes 0, 400, 1,000, 15, and 1,800, because those are where the closed circles are at. Okay, if you have any questions basically about any of the information presented in section 1, make sure you contact me. Make sure you do the homework, because it's great practice, and be careful. Make sure you definitely read the instructions. If there's any word problems, make sure you put the units down, all that good stuff. Now, in the next, we are going to do more videos, so make sure if I'm going too fast, you can always pause the video, write down the information, and then just listen to me when I'm talking, or you can always rewind as well. Okay, see you guys later.